Et donc ça, c'est une question de droits de l'homme, et ça, c'est des valeurs fondamentales du Conseil de l'Europe. Et puis, pour terminer, je vais essayer de mettre ça ensemble sur le concept de langue de l'éducation, c'est-à-dire toutes les langues qui sont dans le répertoire de l'individu et qui sont les langues qui sont dans l'école et de l'école. C'est un peu notre approche holistique de l'éducation aux langues. Et donc, je vais combiner les deux langues un petit peu. Je vais maintenant laisser mon idiolecte français et puis passer à mon idiolecte en anglais, or Hiberno English, as we call it, but I will come back to French a little bit later on. So if I could just briefly now present to you a little bit the Council of Europe. We're 47 countries. We're not the European Union. I'm assuming that you realize that we're a different organization. 47 countries with 5 observer countries. Canada being one of the 5 observers. Founded in 1949, symbolically in Strasbourg in the after-war period. And our vocation is essentially concerned with the 3 fundamental values: respect for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So, in fact, we will be 60 years old next year. We will be celebrating that in a special way. And our work in languages will be 50 years old the following year, 2010. So there's quite a long tradition of work in languages at the Council of Europe. And our work in languages is carried out under the European Culture Convention, which in fact goes back to 1954. And you can see the text there on the screen. But basically what this text says, I won't read it out, is that all of the signatory states, that's all the member states, in fact, plus 2 others, Belarus and the Holy See, are committed as far as possible. The Council of Europe always has to have some qualifier like that, to take measures to promote and support the mutual teaching of their languages, their history and civilization. Now, it's a very old convention. It probably could be updated in some areas, but it has stood the test of time very well, and that has allowed us to do a lot of interesting work in international cooperation for almost 50 years. However, this is a convention which doesn't have any monitoring mechanism. It's a moral commitment. But we also have conventions that have monitoring mechanism. And one of these, for example, is the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. In fact, we have 3 units dealing with languages, and I'll just briefly summarize them. The first one being the Charter. This is the only convention in the world exclusively devoted to the protection of languages. It is concerned with the linguistic heritage, not directly with the rights of the speakers in that sense, but with the languages. 23 of our countries have ratified the Charter, so there's more to be done there, but obviously the Charter represents quite a challenge in certain ways. And what it does, basically, it offers protection to the languages and their use in major domains of public life, education being an important one, justice, administration, the media, culture, social life, and cross-border exchanges. And all the countries that have ratified that are monitored. Every 3 years, they're monitored on how they are implementing the Charter and respecting the particular commitments they made, because the Charter has an a la carte dimension where you can choose specific languages in specific territories, because it is concerned with the languages traditionally spoken on the territories. So it's not concerned with the national official languages, it's not concerned with dialects, it's not concerned with the languages of migrants or immigrants in that sense, but with the autochthonous languages, so to speak. And it makes recommendations to strengthen the languages if it finds there's a weakness in a member state in a particular area. Then we have the Language Policy Division and its twin unit, the European Centre for Modern Languages. These 2 units are not concerned with monitoring in any way. They're concerned with supporting governments with international cooperation, mutual cooperation across Europe in the member states. With Strasbourg, I suppose to summarise it, but it's too complicated. If you go through, you have a lot of the publications of the European Centre for Modern Languages on the table inside the door, so you can see well what it does there. The Centre is particularly concerned with implementation of language policies with good practice in modern language teaching, and it runs a whole series of projects, and medium-term projects, and networks of experts in that field. Whereas in Strasbourg, we're mainly concerned with policy development activities, helping countries review their policies, developing European reference instruments, and so on. So it's a bit complicated how we work. So to explain very briefly, we don't have a policy-making function independently from member states. So we don't make and impose policies. And they're quoting one of our policy advisors. There's no question of us monitoring what member states do, because that's not the function. We are effectively helping countries with the implementation of their programs. And we have to realize that in 47 countries, there's a huge diversity of context. And we've got to respect that diversity and the different needs and the different priorities, so that national policy making is a matter for the member states themselves. We are simply having international cooperation to develop the principles that we can all agree on, and a consensus on those principles. And basically, therefore, decision making about language teaching is as close to the point of learning as possible. And I think one of the benefits of this is that the member states have a sense of ownership of what comes out, because it's their work, it's not imposed on them, and it is effectively approved by them, but also by the highest body of the Council of Europe. The highest body of the Council of Europe is the Committee of Ministers. I won't give you all the details of how this functions, 2,500 civil servants and committees and structures, but the Ministers of Foreign Affairs are represented in Strasbourg, each state, by an ambassador or permanent representative, and they are the executive body, the highest executive body that takes the big decisions. And they sometimes make recommendations to member states, as well as monitoring their respect, of course, of other conventions and so on. And when they make recommendations, the member states are encouraged to do things. A recommendation is soft law, so to speak. And an example of that, the recommendation, here's a summary, I would say, of the kind of principles that have come out in the recommendations. Plurilingualism. I'm not talking about multilingualism, I'll come back to that in a moment. Plurilingualism, that every individual, every citizen is entitled to develop a degree of communicative ability in a number of languages over their lifetime in accordance with their needs. Linguistic diversity, Europe is multilingual. So we talk about societies being multilingual, the presence of several languages in society, individuals being plurilingual, having a repertoire of different languages to different degrees of proficiency. So all the languages of Europe are equally valid modes of expression, of identity, communication, and there is a right to use and learn these languages as protected in several Council of Europe conventions. Mutual understanding. The Council of Europe has just last week launched a white paper on intercultural dialogue. This is very important for us, and language learning plays an important role in that. The opportunity to learn other languages is an essential condition for intercultural communication and acceptance of cultural difference. Democratic citizenship is a big thing in the Council of Europe. 2005 was the European Year of Education for Democratic Citizenship. Participation in democratic and social processes in our multilingual societies is facilitated by the plurilingual competence of individuals. If you don't speak the language of the country, you can't get involved in social political processes. If you don't speak the languages of neighbouring countries, you can't get involved in European cooperation. And that's not talking about a high political level, but just at the level of civil society. Social cohesion, which is really a key priority for us, equality of opportunity, not just for instrumental reasons, but for personal development, education, employment, mobility, access to information, cultural enrichment, all depend on access to language learning throughout life. So plurilingualism, then, we talk about proficiency of the individual. A plurilingual person has a repertoire of languages, of language and language varieties. There can be different varieties, of course, and generational varieties, dialects or what have you within the languages. And competence of different kinds and different levels within this repertoire. You don't learn all languages to the same degree of competence or proficiency, and you don't have the same competence in the different skills, so you have a very jagged, uneven profile, plurilingual profile. So that's our definition of plurilingualism, and I've mentioned that multilingualism in our terminology therefore refers to the presence of 2 or more languages in society. So our goal is, and I'm quoting from a policy guide, to enable individuals to be plurilingual, either by maintaining and developing their linguistic plurilingualism, or by helping them to develop from monolingualism, or even bilingualism, into plurilingualism. And that is quite complex because it's not just about language competence, it's also about values. Plurilingual education means developing learners' consciousness of their own existing repertoire of languages and language varieties, but also their confidence and their ability to develop and adapt these repertoires throughout their life, depending on the circumstances. And in particular, and this is what we really like to try to focus on, that it means developing respect for the plurilingual repertoires and identities of others. And this is part of our intercultural dialogue discussion. So plurilingualism is competence, certainly, and it's also a value. And now to promote those kind of policy principles, we developed the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages and the European Language Portfolio. So I'd like to turn to those now for a moment. We were asked recently by a delegation from Japan. We have lots of delegations coming to discuss work from other continents. And the leader of the Japanese delegation began the discussion by saying, "Where do you get your big ideas?" We were very surprised by the question, and we weren't even aware of the answer until we read back on the history of languages of the Council of Europe by John Trim, and we realized that none of these things happened overnight. They happened through years and decades of international collaboration and cooperation. So John Trim described the framework as a logical development of the modern language program of the Council of Europe over the last 40 years. Because as far back as 1971, there was a proposal to develop a European reference instrument to describe a common core and the sequencing of units or subunits of learning at different stages of language proficiency for adults. Our main work then was in the field of adult education. Now, it wasn't agreed to do it. What was agreed by the governments was to conduct a feasibility study on the introduction of what they call the unit credit system. And the study concluded, quite simply, no. We're not ready for anything that looks like some kind of harmonization, central imposition. They said it's not appropriate for the Council of Europe to impose arbitrary decisions on the field in this manner, or preempt the decisions of others who are more closely in touch with the needs, interests and characteristics of learners. Back to the thing, language learning and teaching decisions being made as close to the point of learning and teaching as possible. So, at least what came out of that, when they said no, was the studies that were built up around that led to the work on a systems approach, so that there was a big focus on how do we link in a coherent way objectives, courses, methods, materials, and assessment in some kind of coherent manner. Well, that in itself was of course very beneficial, and it led to the work on threshold level concept, which I suspect many of you are familiar with, and the idea of what the learner needs to do in using the language communication as a starting point, and then the forms that the learner needs for those purposes. And we had the threshold level concept, which the member states took up with great enthusiasm, and there were about 30, let's say, versions of threshold level for national and regional languages. And that's really prepared the way, as you can see, the conceptual tools for future learning in a lifelong perspective. Let's say that 2 decades later, the ground had been prepared for something like the Common European Framework, which was then introduced. And that came really from Switzerland initially. The Swiss, with their cantons, had a specific need. They needed common standards to help them situate their programs and their qualifications across the different cantons, because rather like Canada, if I've understood correctly, each canton was completely autonomous in the matter of policy. So, I'm sorry if I missed the slide. We went and had a symposium again in Switzerland in 1991, 20 years later, and there it was agreed to develop a European framework that would facilitate cooperation across our borders, and also, of course, within countries, but particularly across borders, support the mutual recognition of qualifications, give us a common basis for situating and coordinating what we do, and give us a common meta-language so that we can communicate our decisions and our practices to one another, and in particular give us a tool for critical reflection. So what the member states wanted, and they were quite clear about this, was a flexible, open, dynamic framework that was not prescriptive, that was not dogmatic, but that should stimulate critical reflection on the issues that we have to address. So, we developed the framework. It took us nearly a decade, between various forms of working groups, writing, consultations with the field and so on. But in the end, we developed a tool to support policymakers and the practitioners, the profession, in reflecting on their practice and on their policies. but we didn't give them ready-made solutions. There was no question of a uniform solution that fits every country in Europe. So respect for the diversity of context was very important. We didn't set out, as you can see on the screen, to tell the practitioners what to do or how to do it. We raised questions. Anybody who knows the framework knows that each section finishes with a box in which there are questions for reflection. It doesn't actually give you the answers. You've got to seek for those yourselves. So it's not a question of a European curriculum, a European harmonisation tool, and I have to stress that. One of the authors, Brian North, described it recently as not only something to be adapted, but a concertina-like reference tool with categories and levels that can be expanded or contracted, elaborated, summarised, adopted, adapted according to the needs of the context. So this framework, which took from 1992 to 1999 or 2000 to be completed, was launched in the Year of Languages, the European Year of Languages 2001. And it sort of went like hotcakes, as they say. It was considered the greatest thing since the sliced pan in some places. But I often wondered why people said that, because when you asked them, many people have read the framework, very few had read it. But they had read about it, and they had seen the scales, the proficiency, the benchmarks, and this was the interesting part. But it took off really because Europe had suddenly got a new interest in languages. You know, the democratization of language learning was no longer an elite activity, it was no longer just an intellectual activity. Everybody was having the opportunity to learn languages. And so there was a whole range of activities, not just in the Council of Europe, but the European Union in particular became particularly active. And you can see on the screen there were the Action Plan for Linguistic Diversity and the European Indicator of Language Competence, which the European Union was proposing and basing it on the Common European Framework of the Council of Europe to survey the competence of 15, 16-year-olds throughout Europe. So what you had effectively was, in Europe at that stage, as you can see on the screen, a quotation from our policy forum we had last year, and Canada was present, I'm glad to say, that there was this need for educational instruments better tailored to the variety of language needs in Europe, and that coincided chronologically with the framework being there to provide some elements of a solution. So now I'd like to turn to the framework itself and the issues surrounding the use. It's not straightforward, as we have discovered. We had to carry out 2 surveys to find out what was happening to it, one among the professionals, various institutions, and the other among the member states, the ministries of education and the governments. And basically what we found, of course, was that there was a positive reaction, and the results were summarised in a report submitted to the Steering Committee of Education, which oversees our work. And in general, what we found was the framework seems to have a major impact on language education, used often as the exclusive neutral reference in all educational sectors. Its value as a reference to coordinate the objectives of education at all levels is widely appreciated. But it was no surprise, maybe a disappointment, but no surprise, to discover that the common reference level were the most frequently used part. The reference levels being the scales, the levels of the descriptors, the global scale and health assessment rate. I'm assuming you may be familiar with the A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2 proficiency descriptors. So one of the things that we can't avoid, because the framework says it, that one of the aims is to help partners describe the levels of proficiency required by existing standards, tests and examinations, so to facilitate comparison between different systems of qualifications. This is important. So for that purpose, the descriptive scheme and the reference levels were developed, and between them they provide a conceptual grid which users can use to exploit and describe their own system. So everybody was using the levels, but nobody was looking further to see why. What was the purpose of these levels in terms of the plurilingual policy of the Council of Europe? And the levels themselves were posing some issues. Is my B1 your B1? Romania might ask Slovenia. Or somebody else phrased it, how does my B1 relate to your B1, which might be a more reasonable way of putting it. So we had I won't say we had a problem, but we had an issue. There are no problems with the Council of Europe. There are issues and there are challenges. So our solution to this was initially to develop a manual that would help people to link their examinations in a reliable, credible manner to the Common European Framework of Reference. So we piloted a manual over the last 2.5 to 3 years, and we just finished it last week, and we'll be going into publication and dissemination this autumn. So this manual is designed to help the providers of examinations to develop, apply and report transparent, practical procedures in a process of continuing improvement in order to situate their exams in relation to the framework. So this manual doesn't set out to propose the only way to do this. That's not how we work. And institutions want to make a claim, and many people are making a claim. My examination is B1, or my examination is B2, and they're asking the Council of Europe to validate that so that they can put this on it. Of course, we are refusing to do that because that's not our function. But we give them the manual, we give them a set of procedures and steps, and it's up to them then to see if they can use these procedures to demonstrate to others in a transparent way the validity of their claim about thinking. So you can see the different stages of the manual. It's concerned with familiarization. So you start with the written definition of the standards in the framework, the particular levels that you're dealing with for your exam, and you look at how they relate to your exam. Then, in specification, you describe the coverage of your exam in terms of the categories and levels that are in the framework standards. Then, next stage, standardization and benchmarking. You work with samples of spoken and written performance, which can be directly related to the written standards. And we provide calibrated, illustrative samples of this for the different language skills. And standard setting, working with test items based on the understanding you've got of the standards. And then, of course, validation, in particular external validation, so you have some independent means of checking that the linking you've done has worked. So this is a self-audit of the exam's content and task types in relation to the categories of the framework. And therefore, as I say, we give some standardized exemplars to do this. And for example, we do this for individual languages, but now next week, in fact Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we will for the first time have a cross-linguistic benchmarking conference for the member states. In other words, we will together take English, French, German, Spanish and Italian, and the participants will have to be able to rate DVDs of oral interaction across these languages. It wasn't easy getting all the right people with the right skills linguistically and understanding the standardization process together. But they'll meet in Paris, they'll have a nice time, and everybody will get the product through the course with the notes. But what is also happening is, of course, the reference level descriptions are being developed. This means that, say, for German or Spanish or whatever, the national authority is responsible for that language. This is how the European Cultural Convention works. It's often the Ministry of Foreign Affairs responsible for promoting its own language abroad. So you have the Goethe Institute and you have Cervantes and others developing content specification, the language and cultural content for A1, E2, B1, B2, C1, C2. So that works ongoing for a number of languages. And for French, because that may be of interest to you, A1, A2 and B2 exist and B1 is in finalization. And there's also a level below A1 called A1.1 for new migrant arrivals in France who want their cabinet to C2. So and for English, if you're interested, you won't see this for quite some time. There's a major project underway with Cambridge, British Council and others, which is analysing all the corpus. It's a corpus analysis of the tests, the Cambridge test throughout the world. And they're looking also, of course, at the psycholinguistic dimension of language acquisition and, of course, the role of the mother tongue of the different candidates in this. So this is going to be a much more empirical approach to this, and it will take a lot more time before that is available, but it's ongoing. So as I said, to leave this point, we're not in the Council here prepared to validate the exam of any body, whether it's a state or whether it's a commercial institution. That would be a landmine for us, it would be a nightmare, and it's not our mission. So we give them these tools, this toolkit around the framework, and hope that people will make good use of it and that they will take their responsibilities. As I said at the forum we had last year, we looked at the framework and what use has been made of it. And one of the things we were not very, we were a bit concerned about was the fact that the plurilingual potential of the framework was not being fully exploited. The idea of plurilingual curricula hardly exists in the member states. Languages sit side by side without a lot of mutual interaction. And the fact is the plurilingual repertoire of the individual then does not get developed in a very coherent way. And this is something we were concerned about. We were asking people, could they not look at these scales and descriptors and see how you can create this profile of learning? Can examination bodies not give examinations only in reading or listening, for example, and valorize these competences and have all partial or plurilingual, maybe the more positive expression, competences acknowledged? We're trying to encourage that. We have a policy guide that sets this out as well, and this is quite a challenge. But what we were very keen to emphasize, and the rapporteur stressed this, that it's a question of looking at the responsibilities that we all have in this matter. The momentum generated by the framework in Europe, as he said, is starting to bring about a new balance in terms of responsibilities, placing increased weight on horizontal relationships among member states, and so raising the issue of responsibility from a new perspective. In other words, states' relationship with the Council of Europe can't be considered in isolation from what other states are doing. We're not a supranational policy-making body. States make the policy, and the use of this framework by all states will be as good or as bad as the states do it. So if there's an inadequate use, inappropriate use, then that weakens the tool for everybody. And a very good example of that is the immigrants who are coming to Europe, in Europe today. For many countries, they have to take a language test before they leave their country of origin. When they arrive, there may be a language test for residents. And certainly, if they want to be naturalized and be a citizen, increasingly there's a language test. And in all the countries concerned, it's based on the Council of Europe system of levels. So these are high stakes. And here we have a serious responsibility for human rights. And in fact, that is the topic of a conference in Strasbourg when I get back next Thursday and Friday, when the member states come together for the first time to look at these issues. What language policies for the integration of adult migrants, and what use of the CFR and other tools to ensure quality provision, tailor-made courses, fairness in testing where testing exists, and so on. And I'm pleased that Canada will be represented, Citizenship and Migration Canada, sending a presence to that conference. But just to go back to the forum, if I could, for a moment. Daniel Coste, who will be known to perhaps many here, very involved in our work, expressed a concern that the framework could be, well, used, if you like, more as a technocratic tool which introduces a restrictive view of language education. I mean, when I talk about plurilingual intercultural education, we're talking about their contribution to democratic citizenship, to intercultural understanding, to social inclusion. And that means that a policy instrument like the framework can and must be utilised, as he said, to serve carefully considered committed policy objectives that reflect Council of Europe values and principles underpinning its approach to language education. Now, of course, this is theory. In practice, how does one mediate that to the classroom, to the teachers and to the learners? Especially, as I said, the great majority of teachers don't know the framework very well. It's not easy to read. In fact, a survey showed that it was considered not at all reader-friendly in terms of the content, and we have to accept that. So we developed a practical tool for mediating this called the European Language Portfolio. So I'd like to just switch to the portfolio en français. Voilà donc ce que le comité des ministres nous a demandé de faire concernant le cadre. Vous pouvez voir ça. Et dans la même recommandation, ils nous ont demandé d'encourager le développement et l'utilisation par les apprenants dans tous les secteurs d'éducation d'un document personnel, portfolio européen des langues, dans lequel ils pourraient instruire leur qualification, autre expérience linguistique et culturelle significative, de manière transparente au plan international, en motivant de cette manière les apprenants et en reconnaissant les efforts d'étendre et diversifier leur apprentissage des langues à tous les niveaux et tout au long de la vie. On a des phrases très longues, des fois. Mais tout est là. C'est autre chose. Mais en tout cas, le PEL, donc on a commencé un projet pilote sur le PEL, pour le Canada, en 1997. Donc le cadre était déjà bien avancé, et donc on a décidé de commencer à piloter le concept de portfolio, pour promouvoir le plurilinguisme, évidemment. Et l'introduction du portfolio, quand même, dans nos États membres, est facultative. Hein? On n'impose rien. Et donc, il n'y a pas de modèle unique. Chaque concepteur de portfolio, chaque ministère ou chaque institution peut élaborer un modèle qui répond aux besoins du contexte. Mais il y a des principes et des lignes directrices établies par le comité directeur d'éducation. Et c'est ces principes qui donnent une dimension visible, disons, européenne au portfolio. Donc voilà, le portfolio a deux fonctions. Une fonction pédagogique pour rendre le processus d'apprentissage plus transparent et favorise l'autonomie, et une fonction d'information. Le portfolio contient donc la preuve des compétences et des expériences d'apprentissage des individus. Mais ce qui est obligatoire, c'est ces trois éléments qui sont là. Le passeport de langue, ça résume les acquis linguistiques par rapport aux échelles de compétences du cadre. La biographie langagière, qui permet une réflexion sur le processus d'apprentissage. Et là, on retrouve les listes de repérage basées sur l'approche actionnelle du cadre, je peux ICAN 2, qui servent pour la fixation des objectifs et l'auto-évaluation. Et donc là, ce sont des listes de repérages qui sont adaptées du cadre au contexte et aux besoins des apprenants. Et puis, enfin, il y a le dossier qui permet de documenter et illustrer les acquis, les projets qu'on a réalisés, etc., et les expériences interculturelles. Donc, un des avantages du portfolio, c'est qu'il fournit des preuves pratiques qui complètent celles plus abstraites des notes d'examen du certificat. Donc, nous avons lancé ça en 2001, l'année européenne des langues, et aujourd'hui, le comité de validation, qui siège à Strasbourg, a validé presque une centaine de portfolios dans 29 pays. Donc, il n'y a pas tous les pays encore, et il n'y a pas encore énormément de portfolios, peut-être, mais c'est déjà bien. Il y a déjà une jurisprudence aussi sur la conception du portfolio qui est évoluée. Donc, on a trouvé quand même, en un rapport annuel par notre rapporteur, que le portfolio est très, très utile. Et ça peut même transformer l'enseignement des langues quand c'est vraiment bien introduit et soutenu par le ministère et par la formation, avec une formation et le soutien pour les professeurs. Et puis le passeport de langue, de partie qui résume les compétences linguistiques, a été adopté par l'Union européenne. Et on trouve ça dans le site Europass de l'Union. Mais, s'il y a 2 millions de portfolios qui circulent, d'après nos chiffres, c'est presque impossible de savoir. C'est un moving target. On sait qu'il y a beaucoup de portfolios imprimés et diffusés, mais on ne sait pas si le portfolio est utilisé régulièrement dans la salle de classe. On ne peut pas le savoir. C'est très difficile d'avoir ces données. Mais on n'est pas sûr. Mais on a l'impression que ce n'est pas utilisé de manière très régulière partout. Mais il y a des projets quand même qui nous montrent que c'est très efficace et très utile quand c'est bien structuré. Donc le portfolio, pour les règles de plurilinguisme, il faut qu'on y trouve toutes les langues, secondes ou étrangères, dans l'ordre plurilingue du propriétaire du père. Maintenant, ça complique la vie, parce que ça nécessite des innovations pédagogiques, parce qu'il faut une interaction mutuelle entre les langues, dans le curriculum et dans l'école. Et ça, ce n'est pas toujours évident. Et le deuxième aspect, le portfolio doit citer l'apprenant à réfléchir sur la manière dont il doit apprendre les langues et la manière dont il développe son répertoire plurilingue et ses compétences interculturelles. Donc, le défi, c'est non seulement le plurilinguisme, mais le fait que le portfolio est basé sur des principes comme l'apprentissage réflexif, l'auto-évaluation, l'autonomie de l'apprenant, l'apprentissage interculturel. Et comme David Little, vous connaissez peut-être David Little, il était à Ottawa il y a quelques semaines pour parler du portfolio, et il nous a rappelé au forum, j'ai parlé, que ces principes vont à l'encontre des pratiques traditionnelles. Ce qui contribue à expliquer pourquoi l'adoption et la mise en œuvre du père n'ont pas encore atteint les niveaux espérés lors de son lancement. C'est un défi donc pour les systèmes éducatifs. Maintenant, notre défi à nous, au Conseil d'Europe, c'est d'aligner le portfolio sur les autres projets de division des politiques linguistiques, notamment celui qui concerne les langues de scolarisation que je vais maintenant vous présenter. Parce qu'on constate une contradiction dans le PEL. Le PEL s'intéresse à l'apprentissage de la langue seconde et des langues étrangères, alors que la compétence plurilingue de chacun est toujours enracinée dans sa ou ses premières langues, les langues premières. Donc il va falloir élargir la notion de portfolio pour que l'englobe des langues premières, beau, mais les langues de scolarisation aussi, si cette langue est différente. Et donc, maintenant, je vais essayer de vous résumer ce que nous essayons de faire dans le domaine des langues. I go back into English for this. Is there somebody keeping an eye on my time? No, thanks. The heads of state and government of the Council of Europe met. They don't meet very often, actually. They met for the third time in almost, over 50 years in Warsaw in 2005, and they gave us a roadmap, an action plan. And of course, the core values are there, human rights in particular, but also intercultural dialogue and social inclusion. Social inclusion is everything. And that inspired us to move on from modern languages, so to speak, and other types of languages to the language of schooling, the main language of schooling, to see what could we do to contribute to help member states ensure that all students can access the full curriculum. Because you can't enjoy your right to education if you haven't got the language proficiency you need to access the full curriculum in the school. So we're looking at language as a subject, Polish in Poland, French in France, 5 times a week or whatever, 1 hour a day, that's one thing, taking a subject, and language across the curriculum. And here we're looking at the language learning that takes place in the teaching of history, mathematics, science, and so on, and the mutual interaction here between the content of the subject and the new forms of language learning. And what we notice in Europe, having started this and surveyed the member states, is that there's a tendency to compartmentalize the curriculum. In other words, language as a subject is treated really in isolation from all the other subjects in the school, as if it was the only subject that was dealing with language. And this has surprised us a bit to find that this was the general perception. And at the same time, we know that learning a subject cannot be separated from learning language. They just are inextricably linked. And the contribution, therefore, of other school subjects to language education is of particular interest to us now. And I know that in Canada, you have done a lot of work on this in this area, and we'd like to see what we can learn from that. Language across the curriculum, I know when you talk about second language learning in particular, it's a very big, important area. So the trouble is that language in all the other subjects tends to take place in a more hidden way than in language as a subject. It's not focused on perhaps in the same way. And this has been described as, by Vollmer, one of our experts, the fact that the more abstract and formal structured language of the school can be quite different from the vernacular language variety of many learners. There can be gaps between the repertoires of socially disadvantaged groups and what's expected of them with regard to knowledge and command of the academic school language and familiarity with the different genre and text types and so on. And because one aspect of learning a subject is learning new concepts and ways of using language, representing new ways of thinking. So that, if you like, learning a subject is extending the learner's linguistic repertoire. And that's therefore repertoire of the school languages. The subject-specific discourse of these school subjects needs to become part of the repertoire, become part of what Vollmer has described as the internal plurilingualism of the learners. And this is really a way of looking at the rights-based approach. The right to education, which is in the European Convention on Human Rights, Fundamental Freedoms, and of course in many other international instruments, is driving this. We're trying to say, therefore, if we're going to give learners the right to the curriculum, what is the curriculum about? So what we're trying to do now is analyse the curricula in member states for different subjects and see what are the competences, the language competences, semiotic competences and so on that are expected of learners, and what are the kinds of learning experiences that they've been offered. So it's a bottom-up approach. We're not saying we are going to think about what they should do, and here it is in the framework. We're trying to build a framework, a reference framework from the bottom up by examining the curricula of the member states. So we're just finalising a tool to help analyse this in more detail, which will be experimenting now in a conference in Moscow in a few months' time. And as we look at the language across the curriculum, it's of course not just a tool for communication in this project. We're looking at the transversal instrument for learning, for personal development, creative expression, developing culture and values, for socialization and identity building, for developing critical capacities and autonomous learning and thinking. So effectively what we're trying to do really is starting from language of schooling, language as a subject and language as a curriculum, to build up a new overarching reference framework that brings that domain into interaction with modern foreign languages and all the other languages that are there, all the languages in and for education, in an overarching concept, an overarching vision of plurilingual education. So that is languages of education for us. It's seen as encompassing all languages in education and for education. And this embodies, it's not just about language competences, it embodies a commitment to the key values of the Council of Europe, from democratic citizenship, social inclusion, respect for diversity, diversity of the languages and cultures in our classrooms, in our societies, of ethnic and social groups. And a global coherent approach to plurilingual education, as you can see on the screen, therefore, encompasses all these languages and varieties present in the school, which are a very complex ensemble, and we have a group under Daniel Kost working on this. Here's a short summary of how they define this: the unique and dynamic language repertoire of each learner, the official language, or languages as subjects and as means of instruction across the curriculum, the languages of minorities, regional languages, languages of migrants or immigrants that are part of the plurilingual repertoire of learners or part of the school curriculum, but are taught as subjects or used as a language of instruction, and then what we call modern foreign languages as taught subjects, 1 hour a day, or as a means of instruction for some other subject, or even as part of the repertoire of some learners when they join the school. So really for us, a languages of education perspective is looking at possible synergies between the different languages in the curriculum, and also between languages taught as subjects and the other school subjects which use those as a medium of instruction. And what we're trying to do, we're just starting, is developing a design now for a dynamic, open, internet-based platform, a platform of resources and reference studies for plurilingual education, a kind of a very flexible system that will allow a presentation of the issues and materials in an ongoing way, which reflect the way the different languages and the different issues around them interrelate. So we're going to build this up in interaction with the member states, and over the next couple of years, I expect there'll be a kind of a whole panoply of issues brought together in a coherent way. We're just working on designing for those at the moment, and bring together all the languages in a more coherent interaction. One of the ways we try to do this in practice, of course, is through our language education policy profiles. I won't delay on this, simply to say that we offer member states a service. We say that if you want to review or renew your language policy in education, we will help you with a self-evaluation. We will not externally evaluate you, but we will, if you wish, help you to reflect on what you're doing, bring another perspective to your own work. So what we do effectively is the countries who apply, and there's quite a few of them are, prepare a report on their situation. They describe what's happening in the country and they identify their challenges, the issues they want us to address. We study that. A team of experts is set up, including an expert from the country in question, because it has to be self-evaluation. And the experts spend a week in the country, and they meet everybody, from the Minister of Education to the parents, to the employers, to all the stakeholders and groups that are in the country. And then they write what's called an experts report. And here they pick up on the issues that the country identified, but they also add new issues that they can think of. And they set out, if you like, a forward-looking perspective. And this forward-looking perspective in this experts report gets circulated in the country and becomes a topic of debate within the country. And then there's a round table held with all the stakeholders in the government and the Council of Europe expert group to discuss these issues and come to some sort of general conclusions. And then finally, the Council of Europe and the national authorities prepare the profile. In other words, Council of Europe doesn't prepare it and tell the country what to do. It's a joint statement. It's not about recommendations. It's about a vision of education, language education for the future. And the kind of things that will inevitably be there in our agenda are those. Because I've mentioned them often enough, I won't bother reading them out again. But what's important for us is this. What we detect in this exercise, and I won't go any further into it at this stage, we're about to evaluate it. We're having an impact study of all the countries just starting now, under Mike Byron, under advisors. We find a lack of policy vision. Countries are very grateful when we help them develop this vision of policy for the future. They're very grateful for the process because they say, we've never sat down together, those responsible for foreign languages, for minority languages, for the national official languages, for the language and instruction schools. We never worked together like this. So we are trying to help in that respect because we find this compartmentalization is pretty common. We also find that policy is considered to be for somebody up there. We never think the fact that policy is local. It's in the school very often, the institutional level, that is fundamental, not just a high-level thing. We find issues around English, which wouldn't be your problem, but it's the language, the foreign language of 90% of learners, the first foreign language. And this is an issue that we have to address in terms of linguistic diversity in the curriculum. We find issues around identity, language and identity. This can be quite tricky. We find sometimes quite an ignorance or lack of understanding of the plurilingual potential that exists within the countries. People don't realize the assets that they sometimes have. So these kind of issues are now being looked at, and we're preparing, as I said, a study, and I think that will be interesting. It will help us perhaps rethink how we also approach this activity. So je vais conclure en français. Je vais essayer de conclure. Comme je viens de dire, notre projet majeur en ce moment porte sur la place de l'éducation langagière, de l'éducation plurilingue et interculturelle dans la perspective du droit et à une éducation de qualité pour tous. Donc, un de nos objectifs en ce moment, on est en train de le faire, c'est d'inventorier les droits des élèves contre une éducation langagière plurilingue et interculturelle et d'analyser les attentes des institutions scolaires. Et là, je vais citer encore le groupe qui travaille sur la direction de Daniel Coste. La question des droits des apprenants porte sur le droit à une reconnaissance, à un développement et une complexe éducation de leur répertoire langagier et de leurs compétences interculturelles. Et la question des attentes des institutions scolaires porte sur la description des capacités langagières que les élèves devraient maîtriser à différents niveaux de leur scolarité pour assurer leur réussite et insertion sociale. Donc, on dit que c'est à l'intersection entre les droits individuels et attentes institutionnelles que s'inscrit la problématique touchant à la caractérisation des standards posés comme indicateurs et descripteurs des capacités visées. Donc, ce projet sur les langues de l'éducation se donne donc autour de la langue de scolarisation, matière enseignée et vecteur de l'enseignement d'autres disciplines. Et comme j'ai déjà souligné, le projet attache une attention toute spéciale au public venant des milieux défavorisés ou issus de l'immigration, et leur droit aux compétences linguistiques et l'éducation plurilingue interculturelle. Je crois que nos activités concernant la langue de scolarisation représentent une continuité naturelle des travaux du Conseil d'Europe dans le domaine des langues vivantes. Mais en plus, ça nous permet maintenant d'adopter une perspective globale intégrée de l'éducation langagière. Et ça, ça nous manque un petit peu dans notre aide au pays, dans les profils, par exemple, que je viens d'écrire. Je crois qu'avec ce volet maintenant, on va pouvoir mieux aider les pays dans cette approche. Et si vous voulez en savoir plus, je vous invite à consulter sur notre site les guides pour l'élaboration des politiques linguistiques et éducatives en Europe, et aussi les profils. Vous trouverez sur le site des rapports qui sont déjà faits. Donc, notre approche est basée sur une mise en synergie des différentes composantes des langues d'éducation, inscrite dans un projet éducatif global axé sur les valeurs de l'éducation plurilingue, y compris le respect du plurilinguisme et de l'identité culturelle des autres. Donc, dans la perspective du Conseil d'Europe, le plurilinguisme est pluriel. Nous ne cherchons pas à imposer ou à proposer une recette unique ou une méthodologie recommandée. Nous respectons pleinement la diversité du multilinguisme dans les différentes parties d'Europe, ainsi que la diversité des contextes éducatifs dans nos pays membres. Donc, toute éducation plurilingue et interculturelle s'actualise dans un contexte particulier. Et je voudrais juste terminer donc en vous demandant si on peut ensemble profiter de cette pluralité et de nos contextes différents au Canada, en Europe. Et donc, plutôt que de vous laisser me poser des questions, qui risquent de m'embêter un peu, je vais plutôt vous poser quelques questions. Et la première question que je voudrais vous poser, c'est pour les 47 pays du Conseil de l'Europe, comment est-ce qu'on peut mieux profiter des résultats de vos recherches au Canada, surtout en ce qui concerne les langues de scolarisation. Nous ne sommes qu'au début. Vous avez une longue expérience, que ce soit la langue de scolarisation comme langue première ou langue seconde. Qu'est-ce que vous avez à nous proposer en matière de standards, de méthodologie, des résultats, d'évaluation? Et par hasard, est-ce que vous avez fait des travaux en matière d'évaluation de la compétence plurilingue, c'est-à-dire plusieurs langues ensemble? Ou est-ce que c'est toujours l'évaluation pour une seule langue? On est à la recherche de ça, comme on est à la recherche de la construction des curriculums plurilingues. Est-ce que vous avez des réponses à nous apporter, à partager avec nous? Est-ce que vous avez des projets où vous voyez d'autres besoins de recherche au Canada dans ce domaine? Et est-ce qu'on peut suivre ça dès le début et peut-être interagir? Je sais que les chercheurs ont des réseaux. Et moi, je parle maintenant de quelque chose de plus institutionnel. Comment est-ce qu'on peut mieux profiter de l'expérience du Canada et de l'Europe ensemble, à un niveau un peu plus formel? Est-ce que si vous êtes intéressé par cette approche des échelles, si vous pensez peut-être à l'adopter ou l'adapter à vos contextes, à vos besoins, ça nous intéresse de voir comment vous faites, d'apprendre, d'enrichir le cadre. Par exemple, il y a des lacunes dans le cadre. Il n'y a pas de descripteur pour les médiations, à titre d'exemple. Est-ce que vous avez fait quelque chose déjà? Vous comptez faire quelque chose dans ce domaine? Les descripteurs pour les jeunes enfants de données. Il nous manque des descripteurs pour les jeunes, pour les très jeunes. Je ne sais pas si ça vous intéresse, si vous faites quelque chose dans ce domaine. Concernant les langues ancestrales, au Canada, nous avons la Charte européenne pour les langues régionales ou minoritaires. Et je sais que cette année, c'est l'année mondiale des langues, surtout concernant les langues menacées d'extinction. Est-ce qu'il y a des liens à tisser entre l'expérience de notre charte et l'expérience au Canada, surtout en ce qui concerne les langues menacées d'extinction? Et la question des migrants. Comme j'ai dit, nous avons une conférence, la première conférence la semaine prochaine. C'est un nouveau domaine pour nous. C'est vraiment une priorité pour les États membres. Vous avez certainement une longue expérience, longue intégration. Mais le défi pour nous, ce n'est pas seulement la question de langue du pays d'accueil, mais comment valoriser les répertoires plurilingues des migrants, des immigrants en même temps, et est-ce que ça crée d'autres défis et d'autres tensions. Et donc voilà, finalement, est-ce qu'on peut mieux organiser, institutionnaliser notre coopération, qui est plutôt ponctuelle pour l'instant, mais très, très fructueuse, évidemment. Mais est-ce qu'on peut créer quelque chose qui maintient cette coopération dans le temps? Et si oui, quel mécanisme? Je vous remercie de votre attention. Merci. Pensez peut-être à l'adopter ou l'adapter à vos contextes, à vos besoins. Ça nous intéresse de voir comment vous faites, d'apprendre, d'enrichir le cadre. Par exemple, il y a des lacunes dans le cadre. Il n'y a pas de descripteur pour les médiations, à titre d'exemple. Est-ce que vous avez fait quelque chose déjà? Vous comptez faire quelque chose dans ce domaine? Les descripteurs pour les jeunes enfants de données. Il nous manque des descripteurs pour les jeunes, pour les très jeunes. Je ne sais pas si ça vous intéresse, si vous faites quelque chose dans ce domaine. Concernant les langues ancestrales, au Canada, nous avons la Charte européenne pour les langues régionales ou minoritaires. Et je sais que cette année, c'est l'année mondiale des langues, surtout concernant les langues menacées d'extinction. Est-ce qu'il y a des liens à tisser entre l'expérience de notre charte et l'expérience au Canada, surtout en ce qui concerne les langues menacées d'extinction? Et la question des migrants. Comme j'ai dit, nous avons une conférence, la première conférence la semaine prochaine. C'est un nouveau domaine pour nous. C'est vraiment une priorité pour les États membres. Vous avez certainement une longue expérience, longue intégration. Mais le défi pour nous, ce n'est pas seulement la question de langue du pays d'accueil, mais comment valoriser les répertoires plurilingues des migrants, des immigrants en même temps, et est-ce que ça crée d'autres défis et d'autres tensions. Et donc voilà, finalement, est-ce qu'on peut
mieux organiser, institutionnaliser notre coopération, qui est plutôt ponctuelle pour l'instant, mais très, très fructueuse, évidemment. Mais est-ce qu'on peut créer quelque chose qui maintient cette coopération dans le temps? Et si oui, quel mécanisme? Je vous remercie de votre attention. Merci.